June 4th, 1944, 150 miles off the coast of West Africa. Deep beneath the rolling swells of the Atlantic Ocean, the German submarine U-505 crept through the dark waters. Oberleutnant Harold Lung stood in the cramped, humid control room, listening to the rhythmic hum of the electric motors. The air inside the steel tube was foul, thick with the stench of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and stale sweat. Lung had been running his boat submerged for days, trying to evade the relentless Allied patrols that now dominated the ocean. U-505 was a Type IXC U-boat, a massive, long-range predator designed to choke off the supply lines of the Allied forces. But by the summer of 1944, the hunters had become the hunted. The days of the German happy time when U-boats slaughtered merchant convoys with impunity were long gone. Now, American and British hunter-killer groups roamed the Atlantic, equipped with advanced radar, high-frequency direction finding, and devastating anti-submarine weapons. For the crew of U-505, the tension was a physical weight pressing down on their chests. This particular boat carried a dark reputation among the submarine fleet. The men whispered that U-505 was a cursed vessel. It was the most heavily damaged U-boat to ever return to port, having barely survived a brutal bombing off the coast of Trinidad 2 years prior. Worse still was the ghost of their previous commander, Peter Scheck. Just months earlier, during a terrifying depth charge attack, Zajic had cracked under the immense psychological pressure. Right in the middle of the control room, in front of his horrified crew, he had drawn his service pistol and taken his own life. The executive officer had managed to bring the battered boat home, but the trauma lingered in every bulkhead and narrow passageway. Harold Lang was a calm and steady officer, brought in to restore the shattered morale of the crew. He was a veteran seaman, determined to lead his men through an increasingly hopeless war. Their current patrol had taken them far south to the Gold Coast of Africa, searching for vulnerable targets. But they had found nothing but empty ocean and the constant terrifying threat of Allied aircraft. Supply shortages and mechanical failures had plagued them for weeks. Lang knew the boat needed repairs, and his men desperately needed rest. He had finally made the decision to turn back toward the heavily fortified submarine pens in Brest, France. It was a perilous journey home, requiring them to run a gauntlet of Allied warships and patrol planes. On the surface above them, the ocean was not as empty as Lang hoped. Task Group 22, 3 of the United States Navy, was prowling the exact same waters. This was a dedicated hunter-killer group, built around the escort carrier, USS Guadalcanal. The carrier was surrounded by a protective ring of 5 destroyer escorts: the USS Chatelaine, USS Pillsbury, USS Pouls, Bria, USS Pope, USS Flaherty, and USS Jenks. Commanding this formidable armada was Captain Daniel V. Gallery, a bold and aggressive naval aviator. Captain Gallery was not satisfied with merely sinking German submarines. For months, he had been harboring a radical, highly dangerous idea. He wanted to capture a U-boat intact. Gallery knew that the intelligence value of an intact German submarine was beyond calculation. If they could capture the boat before the crew scuttled it, they could seize the highly classified Enigma cipher machine. More importantly, they could capture the current codebooks and rotor settings used to encrypt German radio communications. Breaking the naval Enigma codes on a consistent basis could dramatically shorten the Battle of the Atlantic. Before this deployment, Gallery had quietly trained special boarding parties on his destroyer escorts. He instructed his captains to use precise tactics if they managed to force a submarine to the surface. Instead of immediately destroying the boat with heavy artillery, they were to sweep the decks with anti-aircraft fire and small arms. The goal was to panic the German crew, forcing them to abandon ship before they could open the scuttling valves and sink the vessel. It was a brilliant plan in theory, but executing it required incredible luck and perfect timing. Submarine crews were strictly drilled in scuttling procedures. The moment a boat was doomed, the captain was expected to destroy the cryptographic equipment, open the sea vents, and set timed explosive charges to ensure the submarine plunged to the bottom. Gallery needed to catch her crew completely off guard. At 11:10 a.m. on June 4, the sonar operator aboard the USS Chatelaine reported a sharp, solid contact. The sound waves bouncing back through the water indicated a large metallic object just off the starboard bow. The destroyer escort immediately broke formation, accelerating toward the invisible target beneath the waves. The thrill of the hunt electrified the American sailors as they rushed to their battle stations. Aboard the U-505, the sudden acceleration of propeller noises above sent a jolt of panic through the crew. The dreaded pinging of the American sonar echoed through the hull like the strikes of a hammer. Lang ordered quiet boat procedures, shutting down all non-essential machinery to reduce their acoustic signature. Men took off their shoes, communicating only in harsh whispers as the submarine crept forward at a crawling pace. The Chatelaine moved into position and unleashed a barrage from its Hedgehog projector. Unlike traditional depth charges, which exploded at a set depth regardless of whether they hit the target, Hedgehog mortars only detonated upon physical contact with the submarine. A spread of heavy, explosive projectiles rained down into the water ahead of the Chatelaine. The American sailors held their breath, waiting for the telltale shockwave of a hit. Seconds ticked by. The ocean remained silent. The Hedgehog barrage had missed. Down below, Lang let out a quiet sigh of relief, hoping the American ship had misjudged their speed and heading. He ordered a slight course correction, desperately trying to slip out of the sonar beam. But Captain Gallery, observing from the bridge of the Guadalcanal, was not about to let his prey escape. Two Wildcat fighter planes launched from the carrier were already circling overhead, looking for the dark shadow of the submarine beneath the blue water. One of the pilots spotted the faint silhouette of U-505 just below the surface and fired his machine guns into the water to mark the exact location. Guided by the aircraft, the Chatelaine circled back for a second attack run. This time, the destroyer escort did not use the contact-fused Hedgehogs. Instead, the captain ordered a pattern of heavy depth charges rolled off the stern racks and fired from the side throwers. The massive drums of high explosives sank rapidly toward the creeping submarine. Inside U-505, the sound of the approaching depth charges was a terrifying metallic scraping noise. Veteran submariners knew that sound all too well. It was the sound of the depth charge detonators arming as the water pressure increased. Lang gripped the periscope stanchion, bracing himself for the inevitable impact. At 11:21 a.m., the ocean erupted. A series of massive underwater explosions rocked the U-boat with devastating force. The shock wave struck the steel hull like the fists of an angry god. Men were thrown to the deck, equipment tore loose from the bulkheads, and glass gauges shattered, sending shards flying through the cramped compartments. The lights flickered and died, plunging the submarine into absolute darkness. Emergency battery lights snapped on, casting a dim red glow over the terrified faces of the crew. The attack had inflicted catastrophic damage on the aft section of the boat. The outer hull had ruptured and the rudder was jammed hard to starboard, locking the submarine into a tight, uncontrollable turn. A frantic report came over the ship's telephone from the aft torpedo room. The pressure hull had cracked, and seawater was blasting into the compartment at a terrifying rate. The ocean was claiming the U-505. If the flooding could not be stopped, the immense weight of the water would drag the submarine down below her crush depth, imploding the hull and killing everyone aboard. Lang faced a terrible choice. He could stay submerged, fight the flooding in the dark, and likely die a slow, suffocating death at the bottom of the Atlantic. Or he could blow the main ballast tanks, force the crippled boat to the surface, and give his men a chance to survive as prisoners of war. With the water rising rapidly in the aft compartments, the decision was made for him. Lang gave the order to blow all main ballast tanks. Compressed air screamed through the piping, fighting against the crushing pressure of the ocean to empty the tanks of water. Slowly, agonizingly, the dying submarine began to angle upward. The U-55 was heading for the surface, right into the guns of the waiting American fleet. On the bridge of the USS Chatelaine, lookouts spotted a massive geyser of white foam erupting from the ocean surface. The black, glistening hull of the U-505 tore through the waves, water pouring from its drainage slots. The submarine was heavily down by the stern, and due to the jammed rudder, it was carving a tight circular wake in the water. The moment the submarine breached, Captain Gallery's trap was sprung. The American destroyer escorts instantly opened fire, but they deliberately held back their heavy anti-ship cannons. Instead, a torrential hail of 20mm and 40mm anti-aircraft fire washed over the German vessel. Thousands of armor-piercing and tracer rounds chewed into the conning tower and the wooden deck. Inside the submarine, the deafening roar of the American guns hammering against the hull created absolute chaos. Lons threw open the main hatch and clambered up into the conning tower, intending to assess the situation and prepare his men to abandon ship. As soon as his head cleared the hatch, a wave of shrapnel from an exploding 40mm shell washed over the bridge. Lang was struck in the legs and collapsed to the blood-slicked deck of the conning tower. Several of his watch officers who had followed him up the ladder were instantly killed or severely wounded by the relentless barrage. Through the smoke and flying steel, Lang realized his boat was completely surrounded by American warships. He shouted the order to abandon ship, passing the command down the hatch into the panic-stricken control room. The crew of the U-505 poured out of the forward and aft hatches like a swarm of frightened insects. They scrambled onto the slippery, sloping deck, desperate to escape the incoming fire and the sinking submarine. Many men did not even bother to put on their life jackets before throwing themselves into the churning ocean. The memory of their previous captain's suicide, combined with the sheer terror of the depth charging, had completely broken their discipline. In the frantic rush to escape, the critical procedures for scuttling the submarine were botched. The chief engineer had opened one of the main sea strainers to let water flood into the bilge, but he failed to secure the scuttling valves properly. Even worse, the explosive demolition charges designed to blow a hole in the hull were never armed. The engines were still running, pushing the abandoned circling submarine through the water. From the deck of the USS Guadalcanal, Captain Gallery watched the incredible scene unfold through his binoculars. He saw the German sailors leaping into the water and noticed that the U-boat was not sliding beneath the waves as quickly as it should. The anti-personnel fire had done exactly what he had hoped. It had terrified the crew into abandoning their ship prematurely. Gallery seized the radio microphone and broadcast a historic order to his task group. He commanded the USS Pillsbury to launch its boarding party. This was the moment they had trained for, a desperate gamble to board a hostile, sinking enemy warship on the high seas. Aboard the destroyer escort USS Pillsbury, Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David had been waiting for this exact command. David was an enlisted man who had worked his way up the ranks to become an officer. He was a tough, quiet leader, respected by his men. He quickly mustered his 8-man boarding party and rushed to the ship's motor whaleboat. The small wooden boat was lowered into the rolling Atlantic swells. The engine sputtered to life, and the whaleboat surged away from the Pillsbury, racing toward the circling German submarine. The ocean was littered with bobbing German sailors, many crying out for help, but the whaleboat ignored them. Their only objective was the black steel monster cutting through the waves ahead of them. Chasing down the U-505 was no easy task. Because its diesel engines were still running and the rudder was jammed, the submarine was moving in a wide circle at roughly 7 knots. The American whaleboat had to calculate a perfect intercept course. The coxswain gunned the throttle, bringing the small wooden craft directly alongside the moving submarine. The low wooden deck of the U-boat was slick with fuel oil and seawater. The ocean swelled, lifting the whaleboat up level with the submarine's deck. Lieutenant David did not hesitate. He leaped across the gap, his boots slamming down onto the metal grates of the U-505. Two of his men, Arthur Nispel and Stanley Dewachik, jumped right behind him. The rest of the boarding party quickly followed, securing lines and fanning out across the deck with their Thompson submachine guns raised. They stood exposed on the deck of an enemy warship, entirely unsure if there were still armed Germans waiting for them below. The situation was incredibly perilous. The submarine was sitting low in the water, the stern completely submerged by the flooding aft compartment. Furthermore, the Americans had no idea if time-scuttling charges were ticking away in the bowels of the ship, ready to blow them all to pieces at any second. It was a suicide mission by any conventional standard. Lieutenant David moved to the base of the conning tower. He found the body of a dead German officer sprawled across the hatch. Pushing the casualty aside, David looked down into the dark, echoing belly of the U-505. He knew that the longer he waited, the greater the chance the ship would sink, taking the priceless Enigma secrets with it to the bottom of the Atlantic. Clutching his submachine gun, David climbed down the steel ladder into the control room. The air was suffocatingly hot, smelling of electrical smoke, acid, and raw panic. The emergency lights cast eerie shadows across the maze of pipes, valves, and dials. Water was sloshing around his ankles, rising steadily as the open sea vent did its work. Nispel and Dewachik dropped down the hatch right behind him. David barked orders to sweep the compartments. He needed to find the radio room immediately. Every second the submarine remained afloat was a miracle, and he had to secure the intelligence before the hull surrendered to the sea. David pushed forward through a heavy watertight door and entered the tiny radio shack. His eyes darted across the cramped space, searching the bulkheads and the operator's desk. There, bolted to the table, was the ultimate prize. It was the Enigma machine, fully intact, with its rotors still locked into the correct settings for the day's communications. Next to the machine, David found canvas bags stuffed full of codebooks, grid maps, and decrypted message logs. The German radio operator had completely failed in his duty to destroy the materials before abandoning ship. David grabbed the canvas bags and the Enigma machine, passing them back to his men to haul up the ladder to the waiting whaleboat. This single action had just altered the course of the naval war, but their job was not finished. The U-505 was still taking on water rapidly, and the deck plates were beginning to groan under the shifting weight. The stern was dropping lower, pulling the bow upward into a steep angle. If they did not stop the flooding, the boat would sink, dragging the boarding party down with it. David sent Nispel and Dewachik aft to find the source of the rushing water, wading through knee-deep, oil-slicked seawater. The two Americans moved into the engine room. The massive diesel engines were still thumping loudly, creating a deafening roar in the enclosed space. The water was pouring in from an open sea strainer valve located beneath the floor plates. Dewachik plunged his arms into the freezing, oily water, feeling blindly for the valve wheel. His hands closed around cold steel. With all his strength, he hauled upward, fighting the immense pressure of the incoming ocean. Slowly, the valve began to turn. He wrenched it shut, cutting off the main source of the flooding. Meanwhile, other members of the boarding party were sweeping the forward torpedo room. They moved cautiously, checking every bunk and locker for hiding crew members. Instead of enemies, they found something much more terrifying. Strapped to the torpedo tubes were several large explosive scuttling charges. The detonators were not ticking, but the wiring was intact. The boarding party carefully snipped the wires and detached the detonators, neutralizing the explosives. They had secured the intelligence, stopped the primary flooding, and disarmed the bombs, but the submarine was still dangerously heavy, dead in the water, and miles away from any safe harbor. Back on the surface, Captain Gallery was coordinating a massive salvage effort. He brought the destroyer escort USS Pillsbury alongside the crippled submarine to pass over heavy salvage pumps and a tow line. This was an incredibly dangerous maneuver, as the open ocean swells constantly pushed the two vessels together. As the Pillsbury maneuvered close to the U-505, A large wave lifted the submarine and slammed its steel bow diving planes directly into the thin hull of the destroyer escort. The grinding impact tore a massive gash into the Pillsbury's side, flooding two of her main compartments. The destroyer escort had to immediately back away, sounding collision alarms as damage control parties rushed to save their own ship. Gallery realized that only his flagship, the massive aircraft carrier Guadalcanal, had the engine power and the towing gear necessary to haul the heavy, waterlogged submarine. He ordered the carrier to slowly reverse its engines, backing its massive stern toward the bow of the U-505. This was an astonishing feat of seamanship, putting an aircraft carrier dangerously close to a potentially explosive submarine. A heavy steel wire was passed from the carrier down to the men standing on the slick deck of the U-boat. Working frantically, the American boarding party shackled the tow wire to the submarine's forward bollards. Once the line was secure, the Guadalcanal slowly engaged its engines, taking up the slack. The thick steel wire groaned and snapped taut, dripping seawater as it took the immense weight of the submarine. The Guadalcanal throttled up, pulling the U-5 ciphirwood. Because the U-boat's rudder was still jammed hard to starboard, it fought the tow line violently, dragging off to the side and creating massive drag on the carrier's engines. To counteract the jammed rudder, Captain Gallery had to order the carrier to steer a continuous compensating angle, fighting the submarine's pull. It was a slow, agonizing process. The task group was moving at less than 4 knots, turning them into a massive, slow-moving target for any other German submarines in the area. Below decks on the U-boat, the salvage crew faced a grueling battle to keep the ship afloat. Even with the main valve closed, the aft torpedo room was still taking on water through the cracked pressure hull. The Americans rigged heavy electrical cables from the Guadalcanal down into the submarine, powering massive salvage pumps. For 3 sleepless days and nights, the American sailors worked in the dark, sweltering belly of the U-505. They pumped out tons of water, monitored the failing bulkheads, and slowly managed to bring the submarine back to an even keel. It was an exhausting, terrifying ordeal, knowing that one failed bulkhead could send them plummeting into the abyss. While the salvage crew fought to save the boat, the German prisoners were being processed aboard the USS Guadalcanal. Harold Lang, severely wounded but alive, was treated by American surgeons in the ship's sick bay. He and his crew were completely isolated from the rest of the world. They were stripped of their uniforms and confined under heavy guard. The capture of the U-505 had to remain the greatest secret of the war. If German Naval Command found out that the boat had been captured intact, they would immediately assume the Enigma codes were compromised. They would change their entire cryptographic system overnight, rendering the captured codebooks completely useless. Captain Gallery issued strict orders to every single sailor in his task group. Not a word of this event was to be written in letters home. No photographs were to be kept by the crew. The U-55 was to become a ghost ship, a vessel that simply vanished without a trace in the eyes of the German High Command. To maintain the illusion, the Allied forces broadcast fake radio traffic, simulating routine patrols that claimed the U-505 had been sunk with all hands lost. The German prisoners were transported to a special, high-security prisoner-of-war camp in Ruston, Louisiana. They were denied access to Red Cross inspectors and were completely cut off from writing letters to their families in Germany. For the rest of the war, the families of the U-505 crew believed their sons and husbands were resting at the bottom of the Atlantic. It was a harsh but necessary deception. The intelligence gathered from the submarine's radio room was immediately flown back to the codebreakers at Bletchley Park in England and the Naval Communications Annex in Washington. The captured codebooks and rotor settings allowed the Allies to read German naval traffic with unprecedented speed and accuracy. They were able to pinpoint the exact locations of U-boat wolf packs, routing vulnerable supply convoys safely around them. They used the decrypted traffic to launch devastating hunter-killer strikes against German supply submarines, starving the U-boat fleet of fuel and torpedoes. The towed submarine faced a journey of over 1,700 miles across the Atlantic to the secret naval base at Bermuda. Captain Gallery and the crew of the Guadalcanal endured agonizing days of slow travel, constantly scanning the horizon for periscopes. They knew that if a German submarine spotted them towing a captured U-boat, the secret would be instantly broadcast to Berlin. Despite the constant threat the weather held, and no enemy submarines crossed their path, on June 19, 1944, the battered, rusted hull of the U-575 was towed into Port Royal Bay, Bermuda. American intelligence officers swarmed the vessel, stripping it of every manual, mechanical component, and scrap of paper left aboard. The U-5 was painted in American naval colors and rechristened as the USS Nemo to disguise its true identity from casual observers. Naval engineers studied its advanced acoustic torpedoes and its long-range diesel systems. They learned the intimate mechanical secrets of the German submarine fleet, analyzing the very weapons that had nearly starved Britain out of the war. For his incredible bravery in leading the initial boarding party, Lieutenant Albert David was awarded the Medal of Honor. He was the only sailor to receive the nation's highest military award for an action in the Atlantic theater during World War II. Sadly, David would not live to see the end of the war, suffering a fatal heart attack just months later. Arthur Nispel and Stanley Dvorak, the men who plunged into the flooded engine room to close the sea valves, were awarded the Navy Cross. Captain Daniel Gallery was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his brilliant, aggressive leadership. His wild gamble had paid off in spectacular fashion, saving thousands of Allied lives and millions of tons of shipping. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, the secret of the U-505 was finally revealed to the world. The German prisoners held in Louisiana were allowed to contact their families, who were shocked and overjoyed to learn their loved ones had survived. Harold Lang, the captain who thought he had failed his country, realized that his decision to surface had ultimately saved the lives of nearly his entire crew. The capture of the U-505 remains one of the most astonishing feats of naval warfare in modern history. It was a moment where sheer courage, split-second decision-making, and incredible luck converged on the high seas. From the dark, terrifying depths of the Atlantic to the frantic struggle on the blood-slicked deck, it was a battle fought at the very edge of human endurance. Today, the U-505 rests not at the bottom of the Atlantic, but in the heart of the United States. It stands as a silent, massive monument to the men who fought the Battle of the Atlantic. Its steel hull still bears the scars of the depth charges, and its cramped corridors still echo with the ghosts of a desperate war. The story of the U-505 is a testament to the unpredictable chaos of combat. It proves that even in an era of massive fleets and mechanical warfare, the actions of a few brave men leaping onto the deck of a sinking ship can alter the destiny of the world.